Good afternoon. Um, I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute and Director of Hudson's Quantum Alliance Initiative. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another QAI, Quantum Alliance Initiative event. Delighted you could be here. I think you're really going to enjoy this panel. I am brimming with excitement, actually, at the prospect of the discussion we're going to have and the people who are going to be involved in it. And I know you're going to find it as interesting and fascinating as I am. The topic, quantum and artificial intelligence, two technologies which are becoming very much bywords here in Washington, D.C. and around the country. And today, what you're going to hear are some experts talking about not the technologies themselves per se, although all of our panelists are well versed in the technical aspects of these two technologies and other high tech areas that are going to come under consideration. But today we're going to think about the direction of policy, where policy is headed, and where we want to be going with it. And for those reasons, I think you're going to find it to be a fascinating discussion from our panelists, and then also from our distinguished keynoter, who we're also very delighted and honored to have with us in the process. And so Dr. John Kelley, President of Florida Atlantic University, Aaron Van Deventer, here from on the right, from Chief Scientist at Founders Fund, Elsa Kanaya, Adjunct Fellow at Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security, and Paul Steimers, partner at K&L Gates, law firm here in town, and Executive Director of the Quantum Industry Coalition. When I put together this distinguished panel and brought them together, I had in mind a specific set of issues that I thought would be important to have in the background for us as we talk about where we're going in terms of American policy towards these technologies, where we want to go in the future. And what inspired me was a quotation from a book that many of you may know, a book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma, published in 1997. But in the preface, Christensen has this quote in describing what the book's about, the innovator's dilemma. Why is it that innovation sometimes doesn't really take place in the places where you expect it? He says this, that the book is studying, quote, the failure of companies to stay atop their industries when they confront certain types of market and technological change. It's not about the failure of simply any company, but of good companies, the kind that many managers have admired and tried to emulate, the companies known for the ability to innovate and execute. And yet, as he explains in the course of the book, if you're familiar with it, yet then these very good, very competent companies, confronted by these new technologies, inexplicably drop the ball. Well, Innovator's Dilemma is a classic among business professionals. It's used as a textbook in business schools all across the country. It's been updated and revised editions that are published all the time. It's a classic. What I want to suggest to you is maybe that's a classic we need here in Washington, D.C. too. Because what if we were to substitute for the word companies, the word countries? What if AI and quantum are disruptive technologies in Clayton Christensen's sense? In other words, that these are technologies that defy ordinary organization and competences, which are geared towards sustaining technologies, in other words, ones that reinforce already existing technologies in a company or an entity or in a country, and for which there's no true model for tracking performance, so it kind of escapes from the way in which management usually thinks about the technologies that come under their purview, including high-tech companies. Think about Xerox, think about Motorola, right? And the other companies that are sprinkled throughout Christensen's books. So what if these technologies are disruptive in his sense, what happens if the U.S. loses control of the innovation curve? What happens if China does? What if the real question with regard to these technologies is not whether we should pursue or invest in them, but what happens if we choose the wrong way to do it? So that's what was in the back of my mind when I put together the panel today. And it's something I want to plant into your heads as well for today. Let's make sure that we're moving on the right track for developing and deploying these potentially highly disruptive technologies, especially from a national security point of view. And if we're not moving on that track, then how do we get back on it? That's what our panelists are going to, I think, we want to think about when we hear our panels discuss these issues. What we're doing in the governmental sphere, what we're doing in the commercial sphere, and in the academic sphere, and what China is doing in these areas that we should really be aware of. Now, I bring this to you because when you look back at history, which I do as an historian, particularly from the point of view of defense and military technologies, we see many examples of highly successful countries in the past that have failed to grasp the potential of disruptive technologies, particularly in the military sphere, and have paid a heavy price for it. I'll give you an example. Great Britain. Great Britain at the end of World War I was the great innovator in areas in terms of innovative technologies in the maritime sphere. Submarines, torpedoes, naval aviation. I talk about this in my book, To Rule the Waves, about how they were the pioneers leading in those developments. And yet, they dropped the ball. Instead, it was two other countries, Germany and Japan, that picked up what the real potential of these technologies and used them to bring major changes in the way in which naval warfare would be fought in ways that were potentially decisive. It could have turned the course of World War II if the US and UK hadn't found a way to regain the control of the innovation curve. Or take the example of nuclear power. Think about that. In the 1930s, the leading scientists in nuclear research and atomic physics were Germans and Italians. Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Werner Heisenberg. And yet, Germany manages to lose out in terms of understanding and the development of those technologies to the UK and the US with, of course, momentous consequences. Fortunate ones for us, but momentous consequences from the point of view of a modern history. Or take another example that you probably don't know about, and that's the example of Sweden. Sweden in the 17th century was the great pioneer in the development of field artillery. They had really transformed how it was used, not just the type of cannon, because the types of cannon that were used, the muzzle loading, the standard muzzle loading bronze cannon, didn't change. The device itself didn't use. But how it was integrated into the force structure of militaries, the Swedes were the great pioneers in it. And yet, by the end of the century, Sweden had dropped away as a leading military power, and it was France that became the great leaders in the development of field artillery and in the training of men who understood, and officers who understood the real power that artillery used in the right way could achieve. The final flourishing of that development being Napoleon Bonaparte as the leading exponent of the change that could take place. Or you go back even further. You look at Hellenistic Greece. Hellenistic Greece was the center for military innovation in the development of ballistic missile projection, of the development of weapons of war, the School of Alexandria. I talk about this in my book, The Cave in the Light. Alexandria was the center for innovative scientific research with strong and powerful military applications. And yet, within a century, the dominant power in the Mediterranean was not Hellenistic Greece or the Hellenistic states, it was Rome. Rome didn't invent anything, but what they learned was how to use it effectively, how to use siege equipment and ballistic missile equipment as it exists in the ancient world, as an effective and even decisive instrument of war, and that helped to make Rome the dominant power in the world. So all of these examples that I give to you highlight the difference between what it means to lead in terms of research and development of technologies and understanding its decisive application and what a difference that can make in terms of great power competition, but also in terms of the course of modern history. And then you look at commercial technologies and their disruptive effect. The transistor versus the vacuum tube. Smartphone versus the PC. Electric car. All of them are good examples of what Clayton Christensen would call disruptive technologies. Do AI and quantum fall into the same camp? Do they point directions and paths that we need to follow more and pay and track more carefully so that we don't make the mistakes, so we don't end up like the School of Alexandria or like the Swedes in the 17th century? Well, that's some of the questions that I want you to be able to think about and understand as we continue the discussion today. So from where we are and for where this discussion will go, the person who I think that we are very pleased to have on board to talk about all of these issues and to approach the broad perspective of what's happening in the world of academia, the world of research that's taking place, is our keynote speaker, who we're delighted to have here, who is John Kelley, president of Florida Atlantic University. Now, you have to understand, when President Kelley became president of Florida Atlantic University in 2014, FAU was ranked in the second bottom performing public university in Florida. 2 years later, FAU was ranked number one. In 2015, he created a 10-year strategic plan for FAU entitled The Race for Excellence, the key pillar of which was strengthening relations with the state and federal governments. And to that end, FAU has extensively invested in research for marine science, advanced materials and autonomous systems, and, as you'll find out, AI and quantum. They've received funding from the Office of Naval Research, from NASA, from the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy. Now, President Kelley originally came from Clemson University, where he held a succession of leadership positions over a 28-year period, including Vice President for Economic Development, Executive Director of the Clemson Restoration Institute, and leader of both the public services activities and workforce development. And at the national level, President Kelley has served on the boards of the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities and the American Distance Education Consortium. It's my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce to you President John Kelley.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here with you. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of the more difficult places to create disruption, which is education. We have a very successful system, a long history of the way we do things in education, starting with pre-K through K and eventually, hopefully, to college, postgraduate possibly, or straight to the workforce. I believe that system is begging for more disruption. And I'll give you some data points and some experiences in that process. For one thing, we still have almost the same system that we had when my parents went to school. We still take summers off, and that's not necessary, in my opinion. We still have a certain number of hours that we'll go to school. We still have a certain number of credits. We still have an age limit. And even though there are breaks in that age limit, we still have an expectation that you finish college around 22. Many don't. Many take longer than that. How many of you think we should finish college by 16 or 17 instead of waiting until 22? Can you do that? I've shaken the hand so far of now 13 kids that finished college before they finished high school in 1 year. 32 total in 4 years finished college before their high school. If they were sitting here with you today, they would walk to the podium. They would be as articulate as any young person you'd ever heard. They do not stare at their feet. They really are able to communicate, and they're ready to excel. These are not kids carefully selected for their unique talents. These are kids that are given opportunity to learn at an accelerated pace. And I'll give you a few examples, but let me first come to take a look at a couple slides, if I could. We called our project, our strategic plan, the Race to Excellence. It was determined that very specifically for the cause. It's not a walk to excellence. It's not a pursuit of excellence. It's a race. How fast can you get there, and why do you take so long in that journey? Can we speed up that journey? Can we get things out of the way that are restricting progress? Can we quit having to ask 5 or 6 people every time we want to do something? There are a lot of rules, most of them not rules that are written down, but rules that end up happening in academia. And my feeling is we need to disrupt those rules. We need to shorten the process of decision making, and we need to expedite the progress of students through the system. If you take a look at the next slide, we have a very unique location. I mean, one of these places that who would not want to live in Southeast Florida? Very unique in a lot of ways in that we have 6 campuses, 113 miles between the northernmost and the southernmost campus. Both the northernmost campus and the southernmost campus are deep water ports. So the northernmost campus, you can actually, it's a classified campus, Homeland Security campus. We can do classified work out of that campus, and we have an outpost there called Harbor Branch. And the one 113 miles away is it's a private port, but we're physically located on the private port. So we can go to deep water automatically, and we do it all the time. We have an ocean science, ocean engineering program. We were the United States' first ocean engineering program. So a lot of the senior officials in the Department of Navy went to FAU because there are very few places, obviously, you can get an ocean engineering degree. I also point out that as we move down the coast, we face a whole series of complex, very complex challenges. Everybody read about the algal bloom issue this past year. Florida was front and center on that discussion. It is a horrific kind of problem for the economy of South Florida. And when you realize that this zone that we're in is a very unique zone in America. If you were to take the county that we had the main campus in, which is Broward County, it's in Boca Raton, Florida, that county is one of the wealthiest counties in America. Most of the retirees who are there came from extraordinarily successful companies and have retired and still remain active in South Florida. So while we have this one side of the continuum where I've got these young people that you want to expedite their relationship with education and move them faster in the system, there is another senior group that is interested still in keeping active and involved. And so while we have this extraordinary thing going on with young people, on the senior side, we have the largest lifelong learning society in America. 17,000 members that come to our campus for lifelong learning. And these are people, names that you would recognize, business icons that have located in this area. And in spite of all this wealth that's in that region, only 35% of the people in that county have a 4-year college degree if they're between the age of 25 and 65. So a lot of people are being left behind also in the education system. That has to be corrected. If I could see the next slide, please. So when we started the Race to Excellence, it was a pursuit of excellence, a rapid pursuit of excellence. Define what you want to do. Don't isolate it in the traditional academic settings. Find things that cut across the disciplines. And so you'll see on the slide, we put 4 pillars up. We used architectural analogy, and we had 9 platforms. The 4 pillars are the ones I'll talk most about, but I will mention the 9 platforms. What the pillars brought to us is a congregation pulling together of people from multiple disciplines around common ideas of relevance. So one of the pillars, of course, is sensing and smart systems, which I'll talk quite a bit more about. The other one was ocean science, ocean engineering. This unique setting right off the coast of Florida has a very similar topography to the South China Seas. And so when you start thinking about doing defense-related work, it's a perfect area for that kind of work to take place. And interestingly, when you mix the ocean engineering with marine science, you find that marine animals actually have incredible sensing mechanisms that is a natural asset that they have to avoid predators. And we're now studying that particular unique part of that animal. And then we also had neuroscience, this great thing in our head that goes wrong as you get older. You begin to have difficulties. The things don't fire the way they used to. The quantum computing that went on in here does not work as well as it used to. And how do you learn from what we're learning in quantum computing and then mix it to what's happening in each of our brains as we begin to age? And then the last one was focusing on healthy aging, a concept that's important to all of us. So I could get the next slide, please. And then we used the platforms. This is an architectural analogy. These were things we would stand on, and then these were things we were going to hold up and compete against the world. And a few of those I'll be happy to mention. But I thought that it was also important to know, with these young people I was talking about earlier, they play a role in all of this. This is not about us just talking to college students. We have the #2 ranked, we have a school on our campus. We have the #2 grammar school in the United States. This is a public university. We had the #8 middle school in the United States. We had the #1 lab school. And how do we do that? We do it with extraordinary teachers. We treat these students like they're young adults moving in love of what they pursue in education, not being forced into education, but loving what they do. The kids that I mentioned earlier, all of these kids, if they were in this room, would love to sit with you and have a conversation. They would not be shy. They do not stare at their feet. They start by staring at their feet, and then over time they become extremely confident to where you get these young people who are the #1 and the #3 outstanding young scientists in America. You get the kids that I'm shaking graduation hands on the stage. And you get a chance for those kids to do extraordinary things. Publish in the New England Journal of Medicine at age 17. Go to Georgetown Law School at age 18. All those things are real and have happened, and they continue to happen every day on this campus. We're doing things that we think are disruptive internally to cause those things to happen. We're creating a sandbox. Everybody knows what a sandbox is, not the one you played in the yard, but a sandbox where students from all ages can come together, and PhD students and faculty members and 14-year-olds can all work in the same learning environment. And it might surprise you that the 14-year-olds frequently have some of the best ideas for technology and what might happen. We're disrupting everything we do. Everything we do. We're constantly looking for ways to disrupt. We were just chosen last year as the #1 undergraduate research university in America. Why did we get that? Because we believed, and I'm not talking about the high school kids now because we believe it for them too, but the undergraduate students should not just be going to classes. They should not just be taking tests. They should not just be partying. They should have the opportunity to do research in a similar manner as what they might on a master's degree. It helps them career-wise. It helps with their communication skills. It helps with their self-confidence. It also teaches them when to lead and when to follow. All of those are soft skills. If you looked at our soft skill set, we're constantly working on the soft skill pieces to go with the more complex things that are required to reach the academic potential. And so I'll say a few things about some of the upcoming things that you may be interested in. I know my time is short here, but we do have a high interest in cryptography. Dr. Warner Miller is serving as the FAU representative on the International Telecommunication Union, a specialized agency of the United Nations focused on information and communication technologies. We also are working with quantum cryptography to reduce fraud and identity theft and stop cyber attacks. He's also leading to help to ensure the exchange of data is secure for numerous industries such as finance and banking. And then we have an education component to create the workforce for those industries too. It's not just doing the research for them, it's the workforce. FAU and SC Telecom is Korea's largest telecommunication company. We reached an agreement with them for secure communications and quantum physics for cryptology, hardware engineering, and quantum computing. We've also reached a new partnership with Harris Corporation, a defense contractor, focused on mirror quantum optics labs between Harris, FAU, and the Air Force Research Laboratory. We just also received a $652,000 grant from NSF to establish the first NSF major research instrumentation, artificial intelligence, and deep learning training and research laboratory in Florida. We're really quite excited about all these opportunities. We cap these off with what we call Tech Runway. Tech Runway is where you take these ideas and you turn it into a business. So all the ideas that these students have, they have the right to compete for funding, and then to take it and have mentorship all the way through building a business and graduating with a business. To show you proof of concept, 3 of our students are now Forbes 30 under 30, and really quite a great designation for the type of work that's done at the university. Thank you, sir, for the opportunity to present here, and I'm excited personally about the disruption that is coming, not only in the industry, but in higher ed. Thank you. I have a meeting on the Hill that I've got to go.
President Kelley has to dash for a meeting on the Hill, and so won't be able to stay for our panelists. But I thought what I would do, if my panelists are willing to be patient for a second, is maybe pose a couple of questions to you. The first of them is, what you're really creating is a kind of an ecosystem for innovation, whether it's from the point of view of AI and quantum, but also to where we want to go in terms of new models for education, new ways of thinking about what university education looks like and what the age limits are for that. Do you see in all of this a kind of trend? Do you see this as something which could become a kind of trend or a model for other universities or for higher education as a whole, as a component for developing these kinds of things?
The answer would be we do. In fact, we actually, can you hear me? Oh, I thought this was on. Okay. We do indeed do that. We invite people from all over the country to come. So we have almost every week, I keep reminding our staff, we have to keep doing what we're doing too. Let's don't take all the time doing show and tell. But we are bringing people from all over the country who are interested in the disruptive ideas that we have. Wisconsin has sent a number of schools down to see what we're doing. But it's not just schools, it's actually universities coming to say, why can't we do the same thing on other campuses around America? Why wouldn't we use this same model on other campuses? There's a lot of benefits to the model. If you have a faculty member who has a student in our school, it is very unlikely you will ever leave, because you're not going to find the education that that kid is getting in these schools. And so it's a great retention factor for a university too. When you have very bright faculty members and they're looking at what their opportunities are in a career, they're also thinking of this kid who is getting an incredible education that they're not going to get the next school that they go to. So we do try to bring people in, make sure they understand what we do as a model, and we'll actually go to them and help them do the same thing.
Do you have time for a quick question from the audience at all? Is there anyone here?
Yes, sir.
A question to the side there. Has someone got a mic for him? If you could just identify yourself and whatever affiliation you care to divulge, someone will be all set.
Stan Morgenstein, retired from Lockheed Martin. I understand you changed rather materially, your whole university paradigm and made a tremendous transition. But what I don't understand is, how did you had a faculty on board when you came in. And my question is, how did you change the quality of the faculty as well as their traditional modes of teaching in such a short period of time to be able to match your strategy and achieve what you've just said you've achieved? Thank you.
A lot of it was cleaning out what I call archaic rules. You can't do this until you can do that. You can't do this until you can do that. Which, if you miss one step, then you cause this delay in a person's ascension toward graduation, which is just, it's bureaucracy. So we tried to clean out as much bureaucracy as we could. This past year, actually almost 2 years now, we went live with data. So now we can track everything that happens to every kid along the way, including which class is the class where there is a disruptive thing that happens that is not good for the student, and which classes allow that person to move forward and be productive. So we now can do an analysis almost down to what you'd call the micro level, and taking that macro look at graduation rates, the traditional retention rates, all the required things that we measure. We now move down to a much more specific look at the individual and exactly what's happening to that individual and why they did not progress. Sometimes it's something so simple, it sounds ridiculous, but it's something so simple as they couldn't get an appointment with an advisor and did not know what to do. That is just completely unacceptable. An advisor should be acting like a concierge treatment of that student as opposed to someone that keeps office hours. So that's the kind of things that we're changing about the institution to make it more about the student's success than just our success individually.
Are you finding that faculty are responding well to that?
Very much so. I mean, we've improved across the board, and actually now each dean begins to meet with the faculty in their college and each department head looking at what each unit can do to help with our proposed metrics.
Okay, we'll take one more from the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul Joyle, NSI. I'm fascinated with your identification of the type of community resources from the retiree community. Are you reaching out to them to harness them for a mentorship perspective on your technology innovation program? Are you using mentorship from your university, or are you contracting out with other mentors who have been through the cycle multiple times to enhance the success rate of the projects?
That's a great question, because you know the natural inclination would be, if there's all this wealth around here, well, you need to get those people to be donors. You know, that's the natural inclination of any university. I think that's maybe the last step in the process. The first step is engaging those people so that they're now seeing the value of something that's beyond playing golf and tennis and doing other things that are more recreational, but providing mentorship back to these young people. And we find people coming almost on a daily basis, I would say. My wife had dinner with me one night, and she was sitting next to this guy, and he started telling her the story about being a first-generation student. And she said, "Have you ever met these people over here? We got so many first-generation kids." He said, "No, I never thought about it." Then he wrote a check for $1 million for scholarships for those kids. So it is really about the relationship and having meaningful relationships between some of these people that have had such success in life and being able to give back. We'll have another one of those kind of announcements this weekend. It's very similar to the one I just said, where the person just got engaged, saw what these kids were doing in the sandbox, became enamored with what they were doing, became their mentor. He now sends them overseas. These are kids that have never left the state, much less the country. And now he sends them to laboratories overseas to study artificial intelligence. So that's the kind of fun thing that you get to watch when you're not being so prescriptive about what that relationship should be, but looking for what it's in it for the person that's out there versus just what's in it for the university.
And the retirees' doctors are probably thanking you too, because you're probably helping to expand their lifespan by keeping them engaged.
Yes.
Intellectually and professionally. Let's give a thanks to President Kelley.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come. Yeah, you bet.
Our first panelist is Aaron Van Deventer, who is chief scientist and a principal at Founders Fund, one of the premier venture capital companies working in Silicon Valley, and who is very much in the forefront of support for and knowledge of emerging technologies, not only artificial intelligence and quantum, but the whole spectrum of advanced technologies. Aaron monitors the scientific impact of the portfolio, works with portfolio companies, assesses new technologies, and conducts his own research. In fact, prior to Founders Fund, Aaron was CTO of enterprise war games firm, the Prosperity Institute. He's designed single photon and single atom quantum computers in academia and also for government, for the National Institute for Standards and Technology. He advanced the quantum mechanical theory for microscopic black holes and patented the fastest transparent optical switch, all of these technologies that lie at the background for where quantum is going to take us in the future and how we get there. He then developed the next generation DNA sequencing technology at Halcyon Molecular. Aaron's academic background comes with a SB from MIT and a PhD in physics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Now, I've known Aaron now for coming up to at least 2 years professionally. He spoke at Quantum Alliance Initiative's very first quantum seminar, which some of you may have attended back in October of 2017. And ever since then, Aaron has been on my speed dial when it comes to needing to talk to somebody who knows these technologies backwards and forwards. Whenever I come up with a question that I say, how can I get someone who understands this technology and who can explain it to someone with a history PhD as opposed to someone with a degree from MIT, I know right away Aaron's the person to call. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you and to have you get a chance to hear what Aaron has to say on this in these areas. Aaron?
Thank you very much for that extremely warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you today, and appreciate the invitation from Arthur and the Hudson Institute. So you have some slides. Let's see if we can pull those up. There we go. So I'd like to talk today about artificial intelligence and quantum computing and how they are both workable and doable. So Arthur mentioned the innovator's dilemma, which is a problem that gets talked about a lot. But I want to avoid the thinking that it's a trap or that it's a dead end and that there's no way out. In fact, one of my favorite examples of a company evading the innovator's dilemma is Netflix. So as you may remember, they built a huge business with the post office, mailing DVDs to people. And then at some point realized that the future was not in mailing DVDs, but was in streaming over the internet. And so made the very painful internal choice to burn down their existing business that was responsible for 99% of the revenue at the time. And on the ashes of that, built the digital streaming company that we have today. So it is possible to avoid and find your way out of the innovator's dilemma, but it's certainly not easy. And so I'd like to propose a follow-on to the innovator's dilemma, the innovator's dialectic. So what are the questions that we need to ask in order to find the doors around or out of the dilemma? So first, innovation is very important, but we need to think about, one, why do we need it? And two, why is it so daunting getting stuck in the innovator's dilemma? And the third, of course, is what can we do? So first, why do we need it? So the most obvious thing is just for growth. Technology and innovation means doing more with less, which allows us a lot more opportunity. But that opportunity is not always evenly distributed. So people worry a lot about automation as perhaps taking over jobs, but also providing a lot more growth in the economy and capacity to achieve things. But if we look about the fear of replacing jobs is somewhat overblown in that within any given industry, when we see waves of automation come in, it's not the companies that are leading at deploying the new automation solutions that lose jobs, it's the ones that are behind. The ones that are at the forefront of implementing automation usually find an expansion in their employment base because of the increases in productivity allows them for so many more ways of expanding their business. And so that applies to countries as well, that nations that are slow to adopt new technologies and innovation and automation, we would expect to see a decline in their economy and a decline in employment in preference to the nations that are at the forefront of that innovation. So some of the ways that we fight this, that we see this though, is the preference to always be fighting the last war. There is an almost Pavlovian response where once something works really well, you want to keep doing it over and over again. Of course, the future doesn't always look like the past, and so building your army to fight the previous battle is probably not the way to win the next one. Even though you feel, oh, this worked last time, let's just do that again. Whereas the losers of the previous battle feel, well, that didn't work last time, let's try something new. And so it's much easier to innovate on that side. If we think about this in terms of our aviation and air supremacy for the United States, do we want to be fighting the previous battles, or do we want to have autonomous supersonic fighters that don't have the G restrictions, that don't have to have the payload of a human pilot or the life support systems, or the risks of having a human life on board? And so the freedom to develop an air force that isn't optimized to fight the previous battles allows us to be in a position where we can really innovate on what air supremacy looks like in the future. So with quantum computing, it's super important to get this right, because as we are approaching the limits of what we can do with classical computing, and we are coming into the understanding that the world is fundamentally quantum mechanical, so in order to properly understand it with computers, we need quantum computers to do so. But there is, of course, because we have become so successful at deploying the classical computers that we have, believing that the computers of the future, or the quantum computers of the future, must look like the ones of the past, or must follow the same development principles that the classical computers were made from is a mistake. And so it's important that we do have quantum computers available for us in the future, but not get trapped in the development patterns of the past. So why is it daunting, getting out of the innovator's dilemma? And I use the word daunting intentionally and not hard or difficult, because it's not actually hard, it just seems that way. And so understanding the perception of the difficulty and where the fear that prevents us from taking decisive action comes from is really important to finding our way out of the innovator's dilemma. So I like to map these problems of the things that we are developing on what I call the workable, doable axis. So first, let me explain what I mean by those two terms, workable and doable. So workable means you understand how something works internally. The internal complexity is manageable, and you understand the pathway towards invention. Doable is about external complexity, things that you understand what it takes to implement and what the larger ramifications are in the ecosystem and the economy and the larger world. And generally, for most technologies that are at the forefront, there is a workable, doable, conserved product. So as we see on the graph, they sort of form a 45-degree line, where so something like thermonuclear fusion is a very high intrinsic complexity, so very difficult to be workable. But if you understand how to make like a tokamak reactor this way, then implementing it in the world is very easy, because it's just a power source. On the other hand, maybe something like Bitcoin, where the mathematics of public key cryptography that's driving it is extremely workable and very low internal complexity, the ramifications in the outside world are much less well understood and much more at the forefront of the exploration. And then, of course, we have other technologies like reusable rockets that provide cheap access to space that are sort of in the middle in terms of the workable, doable trade-off. So they have significant but intermediate degrees of both internal and external complexity. Quantum computing and AI, however, break this curve. They exist in the upper right corner, where they are both high internal and high external complexity. The implementing of the technologies is both very difficult and a lot of uncertainty as in terms of what the implementation pathway is. And also, once it works, the deployment pathway has a lot of uncertainty in terms of the sectors in the economy and the parts of society that will be impacted. So both these ones are especially daunting, since the daunting is sort of the product of these two. But it also means it's even more important for us to get those two things right, because they are extremely difficult to do well, and so have high barrier to entry and impact the overall society and in our nation in fundamental ways. One of the reasons why they are difficult for workability is because they are both very opaque. And so what I mean by that is, for artificial intelligence, since AI programs are, rather than programmed deductively, learned based on the data, it's very difficult or perhaps even impossible to say what the internal states are, or for any single given decision why an artificial intelligence algorithm has chosen to a particular course of action. So if something goes wrong and you're looking for introspection, the normal sort of debugger tools that we've been using for regular software don't seem to work anymore because of the opacity of what the internal states means. Like what is really being represented inside of the internal state. For quantum, it's even more difficult. Because not only are the interpretation of the internal states very difficult, there isn't a single reality in which one of the states exists. So the quantum mechanics, although it seems very intuitive that there should be some internal state that's internally consistent, quantum mechanics forces us to leave that notion of realism. And understand that the internal states are, even in principle, not measurable or understandable. And so that level of opacity makes the implementation and the development of these technologies very difficult. The other thing that makes these technologies very difficult is on the doability side. So because these capabilities impact so many different pieces of the world and of the society, the infrastructure configuration is extremely important. So thinking about what's the bandwidth of our network, and is it able to support quantum computing? But then also is the electricity and transportation infrastructure also built to be able to absorb and take advantage of the advantages of these technologies. So the question becomes, what do we do about it now that we find ourselves in this innovator's dilemma of these two very powerful but extremely daunting technologies? We need to look for solutions to come out. So. Since the daunting comes from both workability and doability problems, we have to address those separately. So investing in workability, investing in the core technology development that allows United States companies and us as a nation to be a leader in this field. And so that comes from core investments in scientific technology from NSF and DARPA, and of course the recently established National Quantum Initiative. And then also from folks like myself, somewhat selfishly, in the venture capital and private capital community that continues to pour resources into innovating in these areas. But we also need to invest in doability. And this one is somewhat more challenging because it is a coordination problem. One of the key barriers to being able to utilize some of these technologies comes from things like restrictive zoning and underinvestment in transportation and infrastructure. And we see that across the board for things both like the high-speed internet availability across the country, but also that many of the implementations of these technologies that we come to enjoy from our cell phones and for mobile are most uniquely valuable in dense environments. And so allowing the workforce to redistribute itself in a new configuration that can more efficiently take advantage of these technologies is super important. And so the zoning restrictions that many of our cities have, and the negligence in developing the transportation infrastructure is preventing some of that economic and geographic migration to allow us to utilize these technologies. And so in order to solve the doability problem, even if we solve the intrinsic workability problems, requires a lot of deep consideration into the policy constraints that we're now putting on our capacity for doing. And of course, along with that, the tax efficiency. So there's a sort of self-reinforcing nature to the innovator's dilemma, where in some cases, tax reform is super necessary to take out friction from the kinds of realignment that we need to achieve in order for these technologies to be doable, but also to be wary that some of those tax reforms look like subsidizing the old regime, subsidizing the status quo. And so important to be able to distinguish between those situations. However, the national prosperity and national security requires doing things that have not worked before. That's what innovation means. And so, fortunately, by understanding this innovator's dialectic, I believe that it is totally workable and totally doable to be the leader in quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron. If it's okay with the panelists, we'll have questions at the end for everybody. Does that sound good? And I'm
Great.
sure there'll be several, including from myself to Aaron's presentation, and for the issues that he's brought forward. Now, our second panelist is also someone who was part of our original conference, present at the creation. Am I allowed to say that? From our October 2017 conference that really kicked off the discussion, the broad public discussion about quantum in Washington, D.C. Like Aaron, he is also a member of the advisory board for our Quantum Alliance initiative. He's Paul Steimers, partner at the law firm of K&L Gates, and founder and executive director of the Quantum Industry Coalition, which is a group of quantum computing, communications, and cryptography companies working to advance U.S. leadership in the field. Beyond quantum, Paul has focused his policy advocacy efforts on emerging technologies in general, including commercial spaceflight, including information technology, nanotechnology, and water technology. He received his JD from Harvard Law School and his MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Although Paul's biography reflects in many ways an intrinsic modesty that is one of his leading characteristics, I think it's also important for you to realize that he is one of the master architects of the piece of legislation that finally passed through Congress, the National Quantum Initiative Act, at the end of last year, which was signed by President Trump early this year. And what I'm hoping is that when we think about where America needs to go and where it is going with regard to technologies such as AI and quantum, that Paul will give us some of the inside story of how that National Quantum Initiative Act came into being and what its potential is and its implications are for American leadership in these areas. Paul Steimers.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Arthur, and it's always a pleasure to be here with the Hudson Institute. And I should say right off the bat, I was privileged to consult on behalf of the quantum industry on the National Quantum Initiative Act, but the work really was done by a tremendous group of staff on both the Republican and Democratic sides of the House and Senate, and we were just amazed by how quickly all of that moved through last year and was signed into law. But I'd like to spend a moment talking about the Sputnik moment, because we are actually at a crossroads right now in our relationship with China and some other international competitors, where we're facing on a number of fronts in innovation a question of where do we stand and how are we going to conduct ourselves vis-a-vis these competitors, some of whom have very different approaches to life, to freedom, to values than we do. So the Sputnik moment, as some of you in the audience may remember, was actually not just one moment. It was not a particular point in time at which we realized, oh my goodness, there's a satellite up there and it's a Soviet satellite, not an American satellite. It was actually three things that happened at this in rapid succession. Number one, Sputnik 1. The Soviets did launch a satellite. It was beeping over our heads, and that was annoying. But then they did it again. And so they demonstrated not just the ability to launch a satellite into orbit, but they demonstrated an ability to repeat that feat, much like we demonstrated our capabilities in not just Hiroshima, but Nagasaki. Third, we tried to launch a satellite, and we blew up. And so we were faced with a national embarrassment as we tried to respond to this capability that we could not replicate. Those three things combined were our Sputnik moment. And I bring that up because we are seeing the same sort of thing with China right now. China has demonstrated a quantum downlink from a satellite, which, as far as we know, we can't replicate. China has demonstrated a long-distance quantum broadband link, which, as far as we know, we cannot replicate. And this wouldn't be all that interesting all by itself, but in combination, I argue that it is. China has put down a marker for $10 billion on a national quantum center that they're constructing right now. A massive commitment of resources that dwarfs the National Quantum Initiative Act, which is $1.25 billion over 5 years. Not an unhealthy sum, but not $10 billion either. So here we stand, and what are we going to do about that? Well, the natural inclination is to get into a quantum arms race. And there's a lot to say for that, but if we try to play China's game, if we try to match China step for step, and if we take China's approach to doing things, we are not going to win, because it's China's game. China is able to do industrial policy. China is able to do some really powerful things on behalf of its own industries, and China is able to direct resources with a vehemence that we simply cannot match. So instead, we have to play our game as well as we can, and we have to have faith that our system, our way of approaching innovation, can actually meet and beat China's or anyone else's. It always has in the past, and if we do it right and continue to operate according to our principles, I think it will continue to do so. So that means relying on the private sector. That means not picking winners and losers in the marketplace. It means not selecting a particular technology and locking ourselves in. It means creating the environment in which this innovation can happen and not trying to brute force it, not trying to impose willpower upon it, letting innovation, in short, flourish. So, as Arthur mentioned, I was involved with nanotechnology. This was back at the turn of the millennium. Wow, that sounds portentous. we saw a number of things happening at that time in the nanotechnology sphere that we're starting to see, and we started to see about 2 years ago in quantum now. What are those things? There's a lot of small innovators all around the country and the world taking radically different approaches to the problem. And by the way, this is true of AI as well. Lots of radically different approaches. And if you ask any of those innovators, they will happily dump all over the approaches of everybody else as totally unworkable, and theirs is the only way that works. 2, there's scattershot federal investment and interest, but not a lot of strategy. 3, there's intense foreign competition. And 4, there's a national security overlay. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're China and you think that you are going to eventually be able to decrypt our most sensitive communications, why wouldn't you just intercept them now? Don't worry about decrypting them. Let's just pick them up and sit on them until later when, you know, they'll still be interesting. They may not be timely, but they'll still be interesting. And you can decrypt them at your leisure with a quantum computer. Well, guess what? China's doing that. So we're seeing, and then, you know, that's not even to mention things like quantum radar and the various quantum communications capabilities that can defeat quantum decryption. So there's a tremendous national security overlay. And when I saw those aspects that define the nanotechnology revolution happening again in quantum, that was my clue that we needed to do the same thing we did with nanotechnology, which is create a national initiative to coordinate and accelerate federal R&D. That doesn't mean picking. That just means let's all figure out where we are, what we're doing, set some broad goals, and let innovation happen. And so that's what the National Quantum Initiative fortunately does. And again, that happened to come along just as industry was saying, look, it's really time to start thinking about this. So now what we're looking at is the national security side. The National Quantum Initiative Act, as great as it is a civilian effort. It focuses on the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and NIST for the most part. And so what we need to do is apply the same principles of coordination and acceleration to the Defense Department and the intelligence community. I can tell you for certain that that is not yet the case. The Defense Department is still wrapping its arms around what the Defense Department is doing on quantum. And it's complicated by the inherent difficulties of understanding what's going on in a variety of classified places. But what we do know is that it's not there yet, and we also know that we're not where we want to be from a substantive perspective. Our research and development on quantum in the national security space are not where we want it to be. So we need to move it forward. And we're going to be working with Congress, hopefully, to put together legislation that will be similar to the National Quantum Initiative and will complement it. So how are quantum and AI different from previous technology arms races? And it's always interesting, Arthur, to see just part of the catalog of books that you've written that sort of address this through history in interesting ways. Number one, let's start with how they're the same. There's always an arms race. Always, from the, armor versus bullets. There's always been a back and forth, fortifications versus maneuver, always been a give and take across every level of technology. I'd argue that we're different in this case, in that for the first time, the technology itself is capable of adapting itself. And that's a radical difference from what we've ever seen before. It's always been a chessboard where it's been us on one side and an adversary on the other. But now the pieces themselves are capable of retooling to do different things and behave in different ways. And that's going to require a radical rethinking on our part. And in particular with artificial intelligence, which ties very closely into quantum. One of the things that we have to be prepared for and be very humble about is we are not good at understanding superior intelligence. We're not even very good at understanding different intelligence, let alone superior intelligence. But if you have ever had the good fortune of being in a room with somebody who you know is radically smarter than you are, it is a very challenging experience to wrestle with that yourself, and then to figure out how to, imagine that person were an adversary, how to deal with that. That's the level of challenge that we're facing with the combination of quantum and AI, because that kind of intelligence at some point is going to be employed and deployed on behalf of adversaries, and we have to be prepared for that. Two final points. One, I'm glad that we've spent a lot of time talking about workforce development through President Kelley and through Aaron's conversation. It's vitally important that the United States have the workforce that can do the innovation, and not just innovate, but then commercialize. The second thing is that difference between innovation and commercialization, or innovation and deployment, is really important. We spent a lot of time talking about innovation, but one of the great successes of the National Nanotechnology Initiative was a lot of innovation. One of the real failings was that was all commercialized in China. That's not what we want to have happen here and now. As it happens, there's another really interesting book about how you take innovation and you transform it into manufacturing and get it out the door as products. And Arthur, if you'd like to mention Freedom's Forge. Yeah, your book, surprise, book plug for Arthur. Arthur wrote a fantastic book called Freedom's Forge that talks about how one of the things that actually contributed as much as anything else to the victory in World War II was Great Britain's ability to bring a tremendous amount of commercialization / manufacturing capability to bear and get this stuff out the door. And that's what we really need to do at the end of the day. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Paul.
Excuse me.
Our last panelist is actually one of the rising stars here in the think tank world in DC. Elsa Kanaya is in many ways has proven herself to be a rather unique asset in Washington discussions about technology, because there's no one who follows the developments in advanced technologies, including AI and quantum, developments not in this country, but in developments in China. And the quality of her work and the insights that she's been able to bring to bear have, I think, done a great deal to focus minds here in Washington, D.C. on what the implications are in terms of our high-tech competition with China, and whether this struggle for high-tech supremacy with China, as I've termed it in some articles, is one in which we can automatically assume that we win. And that a lot of the policy up until very recently with regard to advanced technologies like AI and like quantum has been geared around that fundamental assumption. And that is that the U.S. has been the leader in information technology and high technology, at least since World War II, and that leadership and that supremacy goes without question. It's basically an assumption of how things operate. What we've been learning over the last 3 or 4 years is that that is not necessarily the case, and that there is, in fact, a competitor hot on our heels with regard to all aspects of advanced technology, including information technology, and that challenger is China. And the person who has helped to really bring that realization to Washington, D.C., as I say, is our next panelist. She's Adjunct Senior Fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for the New American Security. It's a competitor of ours, by the way, but I don't mind. We all thrive on competition in the marketplace, but also in the think tank world. Her research, as I mentioned, focuses on Chinese military innovation in emerging technologies in support of the Artificial Intelligence and Global Security Initiative that's underway at CNAS, where she also acts as a member of the research team for the new Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and National Security. Her prior professional experience includes time with the Department of Defense, with FireEye Inc. Those of you who know your way around the cybersecurity world know that name very well, and the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Elsa is currently working on a PhD at Harvard University and has been named an official, well, artificial intelligence, natural intelligence, an official, are you ready? Mad scientist by the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Well, let me reassure you that this is one mad scientist who communicates a lot of sane messages, and I urge you to listen carefully to what she's got to say. Elsa.
Well, thank you very much, Arthur, for the very kind introduction. No pressure, I suppose, and I'm very happy to be here this afternoon, and thank you so much to the Quantum Alliance Initiative for organizing a timely event on some very consequential competitive challenges. When we think about the intersection of technology and national security, I want to start by highlighting one of the themes from over the course of our discussion by quoting Roberta Wohlstetler, a pioneering researcher on the nuclear revolution from the Rand Corporation, who's also known for her work on strategic surprise, looking at the case of Pearl Harbor, and looking, again, at lessons from history, which I think are important to keep in mind as we look towards a very uncertain future. She highlighted that her research offered the future that we have to accept the fact of uncertainty and learn to live with it. No magic, in code or otherwise, will provide certainty. Our plans must work without it. So I do think that's an important caveat to keep in mind for all of the issues we're discussing at the moment, that whether in terms of technology or the uncertainty of trying to understand China today, of which I am a perpetual student, literally and metaphorically, there are a lot of assumptions we have to challenge and current superiority that we cannot take for granted across the board, particularly when we're talking about technologies that are very rapidly emerging and converging in exciting and sometimes unexpected manners. And I think it has become clear over the past couple of years that although not that long ago there was a tendency, often in DC, to dismiss China's potential for innovation and to believe that China's advances were primarily or even exclusively the result of IP theft and tech transfer, it is clear today that China is starting to catch up and in some respects is surpassing the US across a range of emerging technologies. And while still reliant upon access to international innovation resources, including talent and cutting-edge research in some respects, China is emerging as an innovation powerhouse in its own right. And I think this is quite a clear trend, whether we're talking about robotics, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, or fifth-generation telecommunications, 5G, which has been rather a hot topic these days as well. And I think we have to look at this holistically and recognize that our response must also think comprehensively about innovation as a new frontier of strategic competition today. I think increasingly, again, looking back to history, the rise and fall of great powers has always been shaped by technological transformation, and I think Chinese leaders at the level of Xi Jinping clearly recognize the importance of trying to fully embrace the fourth industrial revolution across this range of technologies to enhance China's economic development and future military capabilities as well. And at the same time, speaking of uncertainties and the caveats I always try to include, I think we also have to recognize that there can be a lot of hype, including in Chinese state media, some amount of exuberance and propaganda, sometimes in terms of how these capabilities are described and discussed, because clearly for Xi Jinping, innovation has almost become a core element of his ideology. There's a focus on innovation-driven development, and ironically, state-driven efforts to really drive innovation and generate greater tendency towards entrepreneurship, and the recognition that in historical perspective, China's past weakness subjected it to predation by other great powers, but today, as China is pursuing national rejuvenation and becoming more powerful by a range of metrics, technology is a core component of that national competitiveness. And I think that has been particularly evident in how China has approached quantum technology over the past couple of years. And from the launch of Mozi or Mishis in the summer of 2017, the world's first quantum satellite, which there actually was an official campaign of propaganda to highlight that as a advanced, generating a lot of prestige, but still an important milestone nonetheless, to the fact that China is further along than any other nation today in actually operationalizing quantum key distribution to enable more secure quantum communications in terms of building up a nationwide network that it's starting to integrate with first this initial satellite and then satellites to come. China, in some respects, does appear to be leading. But at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that we are perhaps not in as much of a race as it is a marathon. Perhaps we're sprinting the marathon, and we'll see how that goes, but there is clearly a long trajectory ahead for a number of these technologies. And although China today may hold a world record in quantum computing based on an entanglement among 18 qubits as of last summer, still multiple parallel pathways to quantum computing, multiple companies and universities around the world that are really pursuing cutting-edge research here. And I think it's too soon or too close to call how this will ultimately work out, though I think the choices that we make today really will determine these futures going forward, and China's aspirations to be a science and technology superpower in the future, I think should be taken quite seriously, but also recognized with a level of skepticism at times too, because although China's 2 sessions or annual legislative and assemblies in last month, there was a lot of talk and a lot of hype about quantum and some claims in state media that China was clearly leading the world. If you look at some of the more technical assessments from Chinese experts, there's also a recognition that there's still a number of weaknesses in Chinese innovation capabilities, including, for instance, in quantum computing and challenges in terms of enabling more interdisciplinary research or developing the requisite engineering capabilities. China's plans for a new national laboratory for quantum information science are clearly a major milestone, but the facility is still under construction. So a lot of this, I think, is just getting started. There's a lot of funding being announced. There's a lot of research support being deployed. And increasingly, I'd argue, I think it's not simply a state-driven approach, but one in which a market-oriented paradigm is at the center as well, because there are attempts to blend together the longer time horizons and robust support of a strategic agenda. Again, at the highest levels, Xi Jinping himself has personally highlighted how he sees quantum technology as promising and important. And this is combined with the robust efforts of a number of tech companies. Baidu and Alibaba are clearly have launched their own laboratories and initiatives and are trying to recruit world-class scientists for this program. The University of Science and Technology of China, where Pan Jianwei, China's most prominent and often featured in the media as a leading quantum scientist, has been really working in quite robust research that does go back to the early 2000s, and the consistent efforts well over a decade at this point are starting to pay off and are starting even to be commercialized. So probably today, more banks, more companies, and more elements of the military in China are using quantum key distribution on a day-to-day basis than anywhere else in the world. But at the same time, again, I think the extent to which quantum technology could alter the offense-defense balance in cyberspace or otherwise also is subject to debate. And I think there are also active research underway showing that although China may have adopted quantum cryptography quite extensively, particularly in light of the revelations by Edward Snowden in 2013, which was actually a major driver of this shift and pursuit of perfect security through quantum, I don't think we'll see perfect security in actuality. I think that's a feature of humans in complex systems, that there will always be vulnerabilities. There have been demonstrated techniques to hack or spoof quantum cryptography. I think it's also an open question at this point how secure China's quantum networks truly will be. So I think we should not necessarily be alarmed, but should recognize that China is really taking a unique trajectory and investing heavily in this. And even if they don't achieve the absolute security that Chinese leaders may be hoping for. They are gaining experience and building up engineering and workforce development along the way. So this will be definitely something to watch going forward, and I think we'll see more and more interesting announcements, from the launch of further quantum satellites to very active efforts ongoing in quantum computing in China today and going forward. So I think we're really just at the start of a competition that is also happening in a world of very globalized and interdependent innovation. And when we think about what the US competitive advantage is relative to China in the world today, I would argue that one of the core features that has enabled us to succeed in recent history, and that China cannot match, is our openness and inclusivity, and including the ability to really welcome talent from around the world. So I think when we're thinking about how we compete with China for the long term, thinking about immigration has to be part of the conversation, in addition to education and workforce development. We also have to recognize that our approach to science has to be holistic, and funding for basic research for the long term across a range of fields should be sustained. And I don't believe that we are inevitably going to lose this race, but I do think we should recognize that if we don't take action, we're facing perhaps unprecedented competitive challenge across a number of fronts, at a time when the geopolitics of innovation are becoming quite complex as well. And I do not believe that an arms race is inevitable across any of these emerging technologies, but clearly there are military dimensions to this competition that we should take seriously as well. The Chinese military seems to be quite enthusiastic about the potential of quantum technology, including claims of advances in quantum radar that reportedly could overcome stealth. Some reasons for skepticism there, but that's another conversation, as well as active efforts to explore and leverage quantum communications on the battlefield, whether for secure mobile networks for units or communications with submarines at sea. Advances in quantum navigation could be used on future submarines or for guidance and navigation of missiles as well. So I think in the aggregate, when we look at how these trends converge, we are seeing perhaps a challenge that is cognitive as well, and thinking about how do we best evaluate the risks and benefits of these various technologies, how do we anticipate which are promising and which may prove always just over the horizon, and how do we best direct our own resources and investments, and then looking forward, how do we anticipate the right concepts for the application and integration of these technologies for future military operations. But I think at the end of the day, I think we should, although there could be reasons why we might envy aspects of the China model and that great state capacity for mobilization of talent and resources, I do believe that if we look at China today, aspects of Xi Jinping's agenda for innovation could prove self-defeating or contradictory, that there is a tension between calling for innovation, but also requiring that every tech company have a party committee, and declaring that artificial intelligence development has to be secure and controllable, including from the perspective of ideology. And I think that there are certain constraints, as well as macroeconomic uncertainties, when we think about the state of innovation in China today, that add an additional question mark to a lot of the claims and hype and announcements in Chinese media. So I think looking forward, the best approaches to competing with China do start at home at the end of the day, which I think harkens back to a lot of the themes throughout our conversation today, that education and investing in our future competitiveness really are the way forward. And I think we should not do that purely because of China, but I think in a world that is competitive, that makes these initiatives and focusing on our own innovation all the more important. So I guess I will stop there, and I will look forward to your questions and to continuing the conversation. And thank you again.
Thank you, Elsa. I'm hoping that many of you will be able to stay. You'll be able to stay here for our Q&A. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is limit my privilege to question and pose questions to our panelists to just one, which I'll open up to all three of you to discuss. And what has been sticking in my brain, in addition to the many points that you've all raised, is that one slide that Aaron showed us and the distinction between what is workable and then what is doable, and of bringing those two together in order to achieve the kind of major technological innovation and follow through. And when I was thinking about that slide that included what's there on the doable list, things from zoning regulations to tax reform to transportation to infrastructure, including, of course, 5G, in which all of these issues will come together. So my question for all three of you is it possible that when it comes to these two technologies, as we look down the road, artificial intelligence and quantum, that we need to revive a term which has fallen very much out of disfavor, for in many cases very good reasons, which is the term of industrial policy? Is it the case that perhaps what we need is a way to think about this in a comprehensive way that brings both public and private sectors together in order to make sure that we don't lose the leadership and don't lose track of where we are and where we need to go going forward?
I'll start, since it was my slide, I guess. Yeah, I do believe so. I think we have to have a holistic view of not only how to generate technologies, but how to deploy them. I like to think of innovation and technology as a value and opportunity generator, but generation of opportunity and value, if it's squandered, is pointless. And so the point of working on the doability side of things is to make sure that your opportunity and value capture strategy is also in place. Otherwise, even if the technology is innovated here, the second mover workable countries will take those technologies and figure out second mover ways of capturing that value. And so the amazing work that we do to innovate them will be squandered here domestically. So I think that having a coherent strategy for how to capture that opportunity is just as important as the innovation.
Yeah, because and the possibility that maybe when you use the term industrial security, industrial policy, that you don't end up with Solyndra as your model of or your representation of what that constitutes.
Great points. I would just add that I think sometimes we see industrial policy as a caricature of what it can be, that we see it in terms of a very rigid, top-down, state-driven approach, but I think a lot of the very simple and, in some respects, obvious measures we should be pursuing are something that come very much consistent with our own history and our own paradigms of what has worked in the past. And I think that gets down to thinking about how we sustain investment in basic research for the long term and recognize gaps where there is not adequate investment from the market and from the private sector at present. So for instance, in artificial intelligence, one good example of that may be AI safety. There's a lot of interest in how we get self-driving cars on the road or how AI starts to be deployed into the real world in terms of products and services, but disproportionately lesser investment in thinking about AI safety and better measures for testing and verification of the assurance of complex systems that pose novel risks and challenges. And then I think as well, I think the government can also have a role to play in terms of coordination and helping to establish a more robust foundation. And I think 5G is a good and challenging example of that, because I worry that we are 10 years too late in some respects to be seemingly starting to think about this, and that we are playing catch up and in some respects playing defense, reacting to the progress that China has already made instead of thinking more offensively about how we start investing in our own infrastructure and establishing a sustainable foundation for our own innovation, which may mean, given the apparently massive expenditures required to actually start to build and deploy 5G, which may mean having a government role for those investments. But insofar as this is infrastructure, that'll be a foundation for AI, for smart cities, for a lot of the elements of the fourth industrial revolution, including in agriculture and manufacturing. I think there is a compelling argument to be made for why having some stronger government support and coordination and partnership with the private sector could be healthy going forward. Well, of course, recognizing that healthy competition and exploring alternative paradigms and opportunities for disruption in some of these markets will be important as well.
Paul?
I think those are both excellent commentaries. I think we certainly do want to capture the value that we're generating. We need to be careful to capture it according to American principles and free market principles, and not to extend ourselves all the way to Solyndra. But for us to do all the work up front and other competitors to get the benefit makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Questions from the audience? And if you can wait till we bring a microphone around, and then as I mentioned to our earlier questions for President Kelley, if you can identify yourself and whatever affiliation you care to go. Question there on the side, and then we'll come around to this side.
Thank you. My name is George Folsom. Hudson's hosted a couple of forums on 5G already, and they've been quite well received. From a national security point of view, then what is the interrelationship between AI and quantum and a rollout of an extremely or as robust as we can actually make it in the United States and in Europe with regard to 5G? Thank you. Is 5G, for example, is it going to make it more doable?
I think if it's done well, yes. Certainly the ability, if 5G is successful, then the ability to transmit much higher volumes of data will be extremely beneficial for taking advantage of the intrinsic capabilities of quantum computing and AI. Then for quantum in particular, having the ability to establish quantum coherent links through the network infrastructure is even a bigger lever of doability on getting value out of quantum computing. So I think, yeah, that is an important part of the way the 5G infrastructure is rolled out. And certainly, if you think of artificial intelligence and quantum computing as generating those opportunities, and the 5G as a force projection to distribute those technologies to more of our citizens, then it certainly allows a lot more access to the opportunities created by them.
I just add that I think 5G is critical if we want to see the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence become feasible in the real world, from self-driving vehicles to improved automation in manufacturing. And there clearly is also a strong nexus to national security there as well, that China's national strategy of military-civil fusion, which ironically in some respects is inspired by what they've seen as successes of our defense innovation ecosystem in terms of building robust partnerships among academia, defense, and commercial enterprises, which they're now implementing at the level of national strategy. That too has been salient in how to think about 5G and some of the specialized electronics equipment with contributions from the defense industry and some increased partnerships among tech companies and defense players. And there's active exploration by Chinese military strategists of what 5G could mean for enabling intelligentization or the AIification, so to speak, of the future battlefield, in terms of enabling AI to be deployed at the edge, or even in terms of supporting logistics or mobilization with smart cities designed to be optimized for those sorts of scenarios too. So I think that this is still at an early stage, and like quantum computing, 5G can mean several things, or there are multiple potential pathways and options for approaching that technology, but I think it clearly could be quite promising and could really be a foundation for this future technological ecosystem going forward.
Question here, and then we'll go to the one in the back.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I think I'd like to direct this to Elsa. A couple of months ago, I was at a meeting and Bob Work said the Pentagon has come out with a list of 10 technologies that are the key technologies that need to be focused on. And his comment was, wait a minute, you can't focus on 10 things at once. If you're going to have a focus, let's pick one or two. So it's a two-part question in effect. How would you suggest, because you've touched on this, how would you suggest, or what body would come up with a decision of which ones to focus on, and which government body really, I mean. And secondly, from the standpoint of the Chinese, they have their list of 10 and so forth and so on. Are they focusing on all 10 at once? Are they going full blast on everything, or have they chosen some to focus on more than others?
Great questions, tricky ones as well. I'll caveat that I'm not quite a mad scientist, but more of a mad analyst. That would be a little bit more accurate to say, or a mad social scientist. So I will defer to others on some of these considerations of how best to fund and evaluate the promise of these various technologies. I agree that I think we do have to prioritize. But I guess one question is, how do we balance between placing a number of bets and really betting heavily on a couple of technologies that may or may not pan out as we're hoping, think with regard to quantum, it is interesting that China seems to be betting more heavily than most, and that could pay off massively, or that could prove to be inefficient, or could end up reflecting a perhaps exaggerated expectation of what quantum will be in the near term. And Han Jianwei, China's leading quantum physicist, recently had to defend himself against allegations that some of his work was pseudoscience at a major legislative session, so there may be some pushback or some recalibration of expectations in light of what is feasible now with QKD relative to what promises may have been made of absolute, perfect, unhackable security. So I think it's not quite an answer to your question, but I do think that we need to think about these technologies in terms of both near-term and long-term considerations and evaluating how they might intersect and converge in interesting ways. I do think we should continue to invest across a spectrum of priorities, because I think it is, again, uncertain at this point as to which of these truly will prove revolutionary and which can end up proving overhyped and less feasible than expected in the near term. But I think one of the challenges is that we are more constrained for resources than China is at present. They've identified 16 or so national mega projects, and there have been major increases in funding for basic research. Again, not necessarily industrial policy, but something that they recognize as important, including based on the precedent of strength of American funding for science during the Cold War and otherwise. And I think that really trying to rigorously evaluate potential trajectories and futures, a much longer conversation there, but I don't think we can choose just one. But at the same time, I think recognizing and preparing for the uncertainty, and also not assuming we will be able to lead or dominate in every single technology.
If I may, what I hear you saying is that we need a strategy. And we need to pick a number of areas of focus that fit together and advance that strategy. And if that's 10, it's 10. If it's 5, it's 5. But that's the value of a quantum initiative. That's the value of that sort of approach, is to let the strategy determine what's necessary, and then to orient ourselves accordingly.
And I just said that I think a strategy is easier said than done, especially around DC. But I think a lot of the very basic measures that we have to sustain and think about, well, what we've all been talking about over the course of this conversation: funding for basic science, supporting education, and recognizing the importance of seeing talent and workforce development as strategic priorities. And I think those are measures that can be done that have applicability across all of these realms of science and technology. And I think it's, for instance, in artificial intelligence, I think it's exciting that the Department of Defense has an AI strategy. I'd love to see the Department of Education also be advancing their own major initiatives in AI. And I think in some cases we have to pick and choose. In other instances, there are certain core foundational initiatives and policies we can advance that will be relevant and valuable across all of these new domains.
I think one of the other advantages, too, if I may point out, that Bob Work would recognize is that in the U.S. case, with all your list of 10, is that the main sources of innovation are outside the government. They are taking place in private companies, they're taking in research labs, they're taking place at universities. So the question then is, the goal for the U.S. government is to tap into and to leverage that innovation in the way in which China has struggles to do so. And the disadvantages of a command economy, and I think Elsa will agree with me, began to become apparent, which is that the priorities and choices are made up at the top instead of taking advantage of what's happening at lower levels and seeing where they can go. I had a question also then to the back there.
Hi, my name is Robert Shines of Bright Group Consulting. Thank the panel, especially Aaron. Your colleague Paul made a comment about how you would feel when you know you're in the room with someone infinitely more intelligent than you are. And so I definitely felt that, so thank you very much. But it's okay. Your slide where you had workability and doability, and you mentioned that there were various hurdles. Don't you think with all of these hurdles that you referenced, wouldn't that hearken for more international collaboration with our partners and non-partners instead of less? I mean, I understand the implications for national security, but don't you think we're going to win the race faster together as a species by working together rather than separately?
So it depends on what the rate limiter is for accelerating the technology. And sometimes if it is just the cost, and the cost is at a scale that even is hard to swallow for nations, then putting things together can be very beneficial. Or if there are a diversity of resources that are required that come from different points, then that would be great. But there's also coordination overhead for doing that. And I think probably the standout example for that is the ITER experiment to develop the Very Large Tokamak, which is actually one of my pictures. And that was a sort of noble idea to have all these countries come together to coordinate and develop a very expensive fusion technology. But the coordination overhead of doing that across multiple governments and multiple languages and multiple continents has proven to be a real burden on the development. And so now they're tens of billions of dollars behind over budget and decades behind schedule, and have been really surpassed by academic and single government and private innovators. And so now I think if you look at was that the fastest way to go by bringing everything together? In that case not. And so you have to look at what are really the rate limiters. Is it just a resources thing? Is it a coordination problem? And so where do the bottlenecks come from, and then figure out the strategy based on that.
And with regard to collaboration, I'd also add that I think what is much more complex today than in the Cold War is that the American and Chinese economies and innovation ecosystems are very symbiotic and interdependent in some respects. So I do think that we have the unique challenge of trying to think about ways to sustain cooperation, including in science and technology, in ways that are important to American innovation, while also recognizing that there's intensifying competition in a number of these fields as well. And there are many productive and important collaborations between American and Chinese scientists and companies, including in artificial intelligence and quantum technology. And in some cases, where it's technologies with a more of a direct dual purpose application and military surveillance capabilities, I think there can be some questions raised about what parameters should be in place for those sorts of partnerships. But in things like medicine and healthcare and agriculture and otherwise, or fighting global pandemics, or technology to combat climate change going forward, of green energy and the like, I think there are still a number of fields and sectors in which we should look to sustain collaboration with China on a number of these fronts, while also recognizing that there can be some important to think carefully through some of the considerations and externalities there as well.
I would say just a couple of things. First, for the record, I was thinking of Aaron when I made that comment. I think it's obvious that it applies to Elsa as well. Second, both Aaron and I are...
Notice I'm left out of that generalization. No harm, no offense taken.
I already plugged like 5 of your books.
That is true. He's got me there.
And I was just about to say that both Aaron and I are, of course, advisors to the Quantum Alliance Initiative, which Dr. Arthur Herman, PhD, is running because of his great vision. And so it is clear to us, and abundantly clear to Dr. Arthur Herman, PhD, whose vision this was, that in fact we do need our allies, and we do need to work together to the maximum extent possible. And the key is that we have a choice about who to work with, and we have some really fantastic things that are going on amongst our allies, and we need their help. So absolutely is the answer to your question as far as I'm concerned.
By the way, I'll segue from that to mention, when speaking about vision, the Alliance vision, on your way out, you'll be able to pick up copies, all of you will, of the report that we did on 5 Eyes on Quantum, on the vision for how the 5 Eyes intelligence sharing network could become the platform for a coordinated quantum technology network that could include other countries as well as the Five Eyes. So I recommend that to you as you go. Our panel has been really very patient and given some great answers. So why don't we give them to one more question, and then we'll dismiss for the afternoon. That question there?
Thanks. I'm Alan Steele from the National Research Council in Canada, and I'll pitch your Five Eyes strategy and also give a shout out to the panel. Very nicely done. Paul, your experiences early on with the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office, I thought was very resonant with the approach that's being taken here. We at the National Research Council work very closely with our counterparts at NIST, both on the nano file, again now on the quantum technologies file. It's important, I think, for us to say that sphere of coordination, that deep interaction that we have in a non-sort of threatening context. I'm a science end of things, not a security end of things. But I think that landscape that you painted about having the bubbling up from below with just a strategic overlay, it feels like that's the collective game, not just for Canada and the US, but for that whole Five Eyes initiative. I wonder if you could just maybe sketch out what you think happens next in the shorter term, not just with your industry coalition, but with the QDEC or other areas where the two countries are starting to think about getting together.
That's a good question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think you mentioned the QEDC, that there's a substantial effort to identify the scientific, technical, and standards infrastructure that's necessary across a number of countries. And again, in that case, the Quantum Alliance Initiative has taken the lead with respect to that as well, in terms of convening and developing standards in this very room to help move that forward. So I think going back to the nanotechnology side of things, I mean, nanotechnologists spent over a decade trying to define nanotechnology. Right? We don't have that kind of time. So we need to have the kinds of opportunities to come together, figure out what's necessary, and then implement it. And I think that is something that again, the Alliance Initiative and the QEDC and hopefully the broader National Quantum Initiative will help with. And Canada has been such a leader on quantum already, and we're looking for many more great things out of Waterloo and Vancouver and a number of other places that I'm really excited to see what happens.
We should also do a plug for Canada and AI as well. People forget that Canada has more AI researchers per capita than any country in the world. One forgets about that, but I think they're also a partner in that sphere as well.
Absolutely.
Why don't we thank our wonderful panel for such a great presentations. And thank you for being here and participating, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event. Class dismissed.